Welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole
and Dr. Ashleigh Thornton, and we're here to interview world-leading researchers, clinicians and people with lived experience
to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Research Works podcast. We hope you've had a great week so far, and we're so glad you decided to join us today.
So glad you decided to join us, and welcome back again, Marissa. I love having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Always happy to have you. We're very excited about this paper we're going to be discussing today. And you know we say that each week. We talk to such brilliant people every single week. But this one is hot off the press. It's about an area that we often don't get to see many publications in. So I'm super excited about this. Joining us on the show today is the lead author of a pretty incredible team known to many of our listeners, I'm sure. So welcome Monica Toohey from the Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Institute in Sydney, Australia.
Hello, how you going?
Very good. Thanks for joining us today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
We're very excited. So thank you so much for joining us. We know that you're, like Dana said, representing a big team, and as is what is needed for a systematic review. So I'm going to just give you all a bit of an update on what we're talking about today and also on your amazing background and achievements, Monica. So today we'll be talking about your article titled Effectiveness of Postural Interventions in Cerebral Palsy, an umbrella review, published in Paediatrics and Child Health in 2024. For our listeners, Monica Toohey is a research therapist at the Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Institute and affiliated with the University of Sydney, where she focuses on improving interventions for individuals with cerebral palsy. With a background in physiotherapy, Monica is deeply involved in the systematic review and evaluation of postural management techniques to improve the quality of life for children with cerebral palsy. Her research covers a wide range of therapeutic approaches, from adaptive seating to orthopaedic interventions, aimed at preventing deformities and enhancing mobility for those with significant physical impairments.
Amazing. Really, really amazing. Great interests and things that I definitely align with. It's amazing.
I'm very excited too, especially that physio in me gets, yes, this is our fundamentals.
Yeah, that's right. Bread and butter.
But before we do, as usual, we're going to jump into an icebreaker, so something completely different. And this is prompted by the Royal Show and school holidays and other activities.
Yes.
Monica, what is your favourite theme park ride and why?
Oh, yeah. So I love this question because I don't have children myself, and I'm a big kid, and so I really love doing things like this. And a couple of years ago, when I first moved to Sydney, actually, I got a season pass for Wet n Wild in Sydney, and so Wet n Wild is definitely my favourite theme park. I reckon my favourite ride, there was one that you have 4 people in a big like floaty thing, and you kind of go in, and there's a bit. Yes. It feels like you're going through it feels like you're in a washing machine. Yeah, so that's my favourite, I reckon.
That is a cool ride. I think I've been on one similar in like Universal Studios or something like that. They're so much fun because you do get really wet, and yeah, it's cool. But
yeah, and there's like dark bits and fast bits, and then a few bits to catch your breath and regroup.
And the lack of control when you shoot out the end of the water slide, especially if there's other people in there, like the weight distribution, things move around. It's good fun.
I find all that very scary. I love that you got so excited about that one. I love that. That's really cool.
I can see it in your face. That's wonderful.
I feel like I'm so on the other side of when it comes to theme park rides. I'm not really good at spinning things. I get quite dizzy. I get motion sick. So theme park rides don't tend to do very well with me. And after going on a roller coaster ride when I was a little kid, I was like, I'm never going on one again. Until one day I went on one without realising it was a roller coaster ride.
That's the worst.
So it was terrible. And I don't know why I didn't engage it. So we're lining up for this ride. They're like, empty your pockets, put your bags into the locker. I'm like, okay. So I go, I'm an adult, should be able to discern this. You line up, going along the path. It looks really exciting. And then you sit down. It was moments before it went off. I was like, oh my gosh, I think this is a roller coaster ride. Sat down, the thing comes on front to lock you in. And I'm like, there's no escaping this now. I'm going on a roller coaster ride. So the whole time I'm just holding on for dear life. You know how they have the photos and they take photos of you in random places? And my face the entire time was of just sheer horror. And every time I did the little climb, I'm like, no.
You're one of those people with your eyes deeply shut.
I was petrified. I was like, I cannot believe I accidentally went on a roller coaster ride. So look, it wasn't my favourite thing to do, but I feel happy that I did it and I conquered something that as a child I was very fearful of, but never again is my
I'm
thing.
surprised you've done that. That's amazing.
I know. Wasn't that long ago either. So, yeah.
Look, I love the swings, those ones where you go up and down and around and you're in a swing and it almost feels like you're flying. You can put your arms out and, yeah, that's my favourite. It's this momentary thought of flying and I don't get too dizzy on that one. So, yeah, that's my favourite.
These are the ones that actually go out. The faster they go, they sort of go, they've got the long chain.
Yeah, and then you go out to the side and go up and down and...
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
See, I can see the excitement.
I know. I'm having fun with you.
Yeah. The funny thing is actually I get really motion sick as well, really seasick, but I love boats. I love rides. Like I just kind of prepare by taking a tablet. Go with it.
I love how you've just taken a completely different approach. I need to try to adapt that. Or I look at it from fear and go, no. I don't think I could. I feel like that icebreaker question is a great informal way of getting to know someone.
Yeah.
That was brilliant. Got to know us really well.
If you come to Perth, we'll have a great day out at one of the theme parks. Yeah.
I'll come along and I'll watch. I'll have my popcorn and I'll watch.
Yeah.
Well, you can relate this to what we're talking about because when you do rides, you have to like have some postural control and lock yourself in. Normally, we can't find the way it links, but this is great. So let's tell all of our listeners a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. So this paper investigates the effectiveness of postural management interventions for individuals with cerebral palsy. The study evaluates a range of interventions aimed at improving movement, managing tone, supporting posture, and preventing musculoskeletal deformities. By synthesizing data from over 200 randomized controlled trials and other studies, the review provides valuable insights into which interventions show the most promise, while also highlighting the need for further research due to the overall low quality of evidence in many areas. The findings offer practical recommendations for clinicians and caregivers working to improve the quality of life for children with cerebral palsy.
Incredible.
Ooh,
very
so
excited. But let's start, Monica, with talking about postural control. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's defined and what it means?
Yeah. So postural control, I think a lot of people would just think of this as balance. And so it's being able to maintain your body's centre of mass over your base of support or maintaining the ability to align and adjust your body segments against gravity without falling or collapsing. And it involves, there's a lot of different processes involved in postural control, but there's kind of anticipatory postural control, which is you kind of recognise that something's going to happen, and so you make an adjustment in your body so that can happen. So an example is like even reaching. So we're not even aware of this, but if I was going to reach over and get my a cup of tea to have a drink, my body would make some postural adjustments to anticipate that that's going to happen. And then the other one is reactive. And so that's where, like you're at the shops and someone bumps you and you might need to kind of take a couple of steps to catch your balance, or, you might need to kind of do a bit of a lean and then come back again. And so that's how to react when your postural control is challenged. When you didn't know that was coming.
Yeah, that's really good. I like that.
Great description. Now, can you tell us a bit about how it's established?
So it's established really from really early. So there's been some studies in babies where they looked at they put electrodes on their postural muscles, and from 1 month of age, when a baby was sitting, kind of held in sitting, and something happened to change their position, they could see that these postural muscles were starting to fire to control the baby's position. And so that's a baby that can't even sit yet. And so it's starting from really, really early. And the way it kind of develops in humans is that we get development over our head first. So babies sort of, develop head control first, and then it sort of works down. Then you develop the ability to sit and then to sit and do things, and then to start to be up on your legs, starting to pull up to stand, starting to walk, and then getting more challenging from there. But humans are pretty slow compared to a lot of animals that, pop out of the womb and start walking.
True. Okay, I didn't think of that.
I did find that fascinating. So it really is a process that just adapts and grows as the human gets bigger and mentally starts working differently, really, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. And one of the tricky things that happens too is that when we're babies, we've obviously got quite small bodies. I often say to parents, it's fine to make them small because when you fall over, it's not so far. And as our bodies get bigger, we have to adjust to our changing bodies, and that's why teenagers often look a little bit gangly and uncoordinated because their bodies are growing so rapidly that they're sort of like trying to work out, how do I move my body now?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's funny that you said that. Actually, I caught up with someone yesterday and they were saying how their son's just suddenly grown and really tall. And my first thing was, that really gangly, awkward, poorly coordinated face. And he's like, yes, he is.
Yeah.
But you can see it, and your body has to cope with that. And it doesn't seem like they're just quite one yet.
Yes, yeah. So obviously the most rapid development is kind of over the first 12 to 24 months, but it's really developing, and we're having to adjust throughout our lives. And then, at the other end, as aging processes start, and we have to start adjusting to, how we're working with our aging bodies as well.
Yeah,
amazing. And you can see how it's so important, obviously, to us in our everyday life, in everything, even you're talking about from anticipatory when we don't do things we don't even think about, reaching for things and getting us around safely. And
And so like Dana on the roller coaster was probably anticipating and just like
clenching.
I know, my neck muscles, everything was just sore. It should have been. I just didn't go with the flow.
And now, obviously, it allows us to move, to be safe on our feet. But now bringing back to children with cerebral palsy, what do we see in this population with regards to postural control?
Yeah.
So we really see that it's definitely affected. Because when you look at a picture of a brain, so cerebral palsy is defined as a disorder of movement and posture. So, and we often forget that posture bit, and posture is really important for movement. By some kind of injury, usually to injury or maldevelopment to the brain, or some issue with some difference with the way the brain works and controls movement. And so and the processes involved in postural control, like obviously this is mainly an audio medium, and so I can't show you a picture, but when you look at, from a neuroanatomy textbook, when you look at a picture of the brain and they show you all the parts of the brain that are that are impacted, that are involved in postural control, and, it's heaps. And so when you've got something that affects the brain, that's going to affect how those processes work, and the pathways, that the processes and the messages that need to be travelling up and down and through between different parts of the brain. And some of the parts of the brain that are really involved are the cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, the thalamus, the cerebellum. And so if you've read any MRI reports from children with cerebral or from people with cerebral palsy, a lot of those are some of the key words that are often coming up as parts of the brain that are affected. Yeah.
And can you describe to us then, you go?
I was going to say, and we know that it's more the postural control is more affected as motor impairment increases as well. And the GMFCS is basically a description of, postural control at different different levels of, postural control impairment. So children with GMFCS level 1 have not very much postural control impairment compared to children at people at GMFCS level 5.
It's such an important point to make about the GMFCS levels. It's directly related because that's how it was really formed, and you think about all the anti-gravity movements that are needed. But I love how you brought up the different parts of the brain that are affected, because you can't just say you're working on one thing in one area. It's such a complex network. It's vision that drives a lot of it as well. It's your position in space. It's feedback, sensory information and feedback. It is a complex process, isn't it? It's not one-dimensional
and everything happening really fast as well. So,
for it to be effective in real time.
Yes.
We could talk about this for ages.
I know, because then with like that, across the GMFCS levels, like you talked about, the large differences in postural control there for our interventions, which is what we're going to jump into, is so varied.
So true. Yeah, that's a really good insight. One of the things that I did see in your systematic review was the reference to the really well-known Gough article in 2009. Now, we did manage to speak with Martin at the last conference at EACD, and when you speak with him and you see him present in person, you realise what a deep thinker he is. Like that was just one of the best things, was to see how he thinks about things. And so the last time you sort of reviewed this, and this was referred to in your article quite a few times in 2009, so that was probably the last time a review like this was done. Do you remember what some of the recommendations or what some of the conclusions were based on that article? And I guess what was your motivation then from that to embarking on this systematic review?
Yeah. So some of the key findings in that paper were they talked about passive stretching and included sleep systems in that. And they found that there was no evidence for that passive stretching or use of orthoses affected the development of deformity. So orthoses might have other indications, but for prevention of deformity, they didn't do anything to change that.
Wow.
They also talked about issues with studies, like around stretching. They talked about issues with some studies where they only included people who were able to adhere to a program for a kind of a certain amount. Like, so anyone that didn't do it for a certain amount, like who didn't kind of meet the dosage that they were needing for that intervention, weren't included. And so that's obviously an issue, because the people most likely to not be able to manage those programs are the people who are most likely to have those impairments. And so that's kind of, so that's a real issue. And one of the things that they pointed out that often there were unintended consequences as well. So pain is a big one that came up with stretching programs as well. And so they needed to be, they really recommended that they needed to be more measurement of pain with any postural interventions, postural management interventions. They also talked about assistive devices. So with seating and standing frames, there was little evidence for specific seating systems preventing deformity, and that they weren't as effective in practice in improving posture as well, which, I think but also it's really hard to study some of these things, because they talked about specific seating systems where I think if, in practice we know that you can't just say this seating system is going to be right for all these people.
That's
there's a lot of things that come in. So that's one of the issues, is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in our population, but also in our interventions. So a lot of talk about the personal factors, so pain being a really big one, and the impact of communication on pain as well, like being able to communicate pain. That potentially is underreported, because again, the people most likely to be having issues with pain and having some of these interventions are the least able to self-report that. And they also talked a lot about needing to move away from this focus on body structure and function towards activity and participation. And I've actually, do you mind if I read out a quote that I've written down from this paper?
Sure.
So this is verbatim. Gough said, a reduction in the allocation of resources to physical postural management programs aimed at preventing deformity may make these resources available for other management options. And they were meaning things like communication, participation, and transition to adulthood. So this is 15 years ago.
Wow.
Wow. So I guess we're really interested in knowing what has happened since then, because they made Gough made some really great recommendations and suggestions, actually. And I guess the motivation for this paper was it was invited as part of an issue of a journal that's called Pediatrics and Child Health. And that journal is aimed at paediatricians and paediatric trainees in the UK. And they kind of have issues on certain topics. And so this was part of an issue that was on cerebral palsy. And so there's other papers in that issue covering like AFOs in CP, upper limb function in CP, management of hypertonia in CP. And this was a paper in that issue about postural management in CP, and kind of just giving an overview of the state of the evidence in this area. It's so great,
especially in light of what Gough said. Like you said, 15 years ago, great recommendations. Let's see what people did, hey?
So I know that you and your team, it was an umbrella systematic review. What is this?
Yeah, it's very...
I haven't heard of about umbrellas.
No, so you might not have heard that term before, but I imagine that a lot of people listening will have read an umbrella systematic review, or at least know of one. So the traffic light paper that Iona Novak led is an umbrella systematic review. And so what an umbrella systematic review is, it's like a review of reviews. So it's where you collect and assess the kind of quality and the findings of multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses on a topic.
Yeah.
So it's kind of pulling together because it's sort of, and this methodology was sort of developed because thankfully over the years, like there's heaps more systematic reviews that are being published, but it's sort of hard to navigate because systematic reviews have a very specific scope.
Yes.
And so it's sort of hard to navigate, there's all these different systematic reviews and how do we pull them together to sort of put some of those findings together. But that's the aim of an umbrella review.
I guess, when you think about an umbrella, it really is something that's meant to be something that covers as much of it as it can. It's the mother of systematic reviews kind of thing. So it's comprehensive is what we're trying to say as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very cool. I like it.
And can you go into detail for us of this massive, comprehensive systematic review? What was included? What were your terms and what were you focusing on?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So we did an initial search that was just sort of posture and CP, and that was how we kind of came up with some of these, with like our initial list of interventions that we might sort of look at individually. And then we kept it, we tried to keep it quite broad. So we, like our population was CP, so like thinking that PICO, expression framework. So our population was CP. The interventions, so initially we just sort of searched for any intervention, and then we came up with this list and we all kind of, went off in our little writing pairs to do a search for some of the interventions that we'd found. And then our comparison was any comparison. So we didn't mind, we didn't mind what was the comparison, like what was the other interventions that people were doing in comparison to that. And the outcome was any outcome as well. So we're interested in any outcome from this intervention, but kind of with this, we had this real lens of postural kind of postural control or maintenance of posture by prevention of defaulty or things like that. And we just included systematic reviews. That was our preference, was to just include systematic reviews, but there were some interventions that no systematic review had been done, and so then we might kind of drop down to sort of lower levels of evidence for interventions that were like, these are really commonly used and we still want to include them in the paper because even though there's no systematic reviews being done on them, we want to present the evidence that is there because we know some of these are so commonly used. Yeah,
that's brilliant. And I love that you have done that because often those are the ones that we're curious about because there's nothing published on them. So we'll talk more about that in a bit, but yes.
So when you're doing systematic reviews and you're obviously looking at studies that are including postural control and postural management, can you describe a bit more about how postural control is measured and assessed?
Yeah, so really varied. So it's really interesting, actually. I was looking at, what are assessments of postural control, and there are a lot of assessments of postural control that measure kind of aspects of postural control specifically. So there's things like the SATCO, which is the segmental assessment of trunk control, the pediatric reach test, the timed up and go test is considered the measurement of postural control, the kids best test or the best test, there's a lot early clinical assessment of balance. There's a lot of kind of assessments of postural control. It was really actually interesting looking then at this list of assessments and then looking at all the outcomes measurements that we used in these papers, and I don't think any of those were used in measuring postural control. In the papers that we in the primary outcomes that we kind of found. So a lot of the outcomes that we used in the papers that were included in our systematic review were like the GMFM, so either the whole gross, like the gross motor function measure, so either the GMFM 66 or subtests of that, sometimes, just using the subtest in isolation to look at the different kind of aspects of gross motor function, or gait parameters, or measures of upper limb function, or range of motion, or range of motion was used, like trunk, spinal, like cob angles, things like that. So the ones that are more looking at deformity, so they're postural management rather than postural control. A
lot of challenges there, aren't they? I mean, already measuring just one component of it, but it's a complex. Postural control is complex, and so to measure it, requires a lot of thought about what kind of assessments reflect the actual activity itself, which is really interesting. Okay, so let's get into some of the results of what you found. I mean, I guess just for everyone to know, definitely want people to look at the article. It's presented beautifully, so easy to read. So there were 33 studies that were included, which appraised 41 different interventions from 27 primary systematic reviews, 4 RCTs.
22,000 participants, in all those studies.
So it's comprehensive. I mean, this is why this is so important.
Wow.
And the way you presented it, I love how you did mention about, the traffic light system that Iona had led a few years ago. It's presented beautifully with a beautiful diagram as well, which I love a good diagram. So we're going to start to go through that. So I thought maybe let's start with the ones that are below the worth it line for movement. And when you look at what's below the worth it line, there's the usual things that we've seen in the previous reviews already. So we've got NDT or bow bath, Voiter, which is often there too, and suit therapy. But there's 2 there that we haven't really seen published anywhere before, but like you said in the paper, are commonly used in private practice. So there's both CME and DMI, CME quevosmetic exercises and DMI dynamic movement intervention. So talk us through a little bit more about what was below that worth it line and why they find themselves there.
So those interventions are often what we would call more passive interventions or like bottom-up interventions, in that they're really kind of working at the primary kind of impairment rather than what's the outcome that's affecting.
Yes.
Or what's the function that's affecting. So a lot of these are really working on, those primary level impairments.
Yes.
So we put them below the line because the findings from the findings from studies were that they weren't effective compared to, in the example of NDT, like wasn't effective compared to no intervention, or when compared to activity-based interventions or body structure and function-based approaches was less effective than those interventions.
Yes.
So that's why that one's ended up below the line. And I know you've had a whole episode with Anna Tabella, who did a recent systematic review and meta-analysis on that. So again, probably direct people to some of the discussion.
That's right.
Well, I mean, and it's consistent because we weren't generating new knowledge. We were drawing on all the systematic reviews that were already out there. So that was the systematic review that we used for for this for that intervention.
That makes sense.
And then some of the others, like Voiter, did have a systematic review. But when we looked at that systematic review, there was actually no one with CP who was included in that, who was in that systematic review. It was people with other conditions or like ex-prem babies who it didn't specify whether they went on to have CP or not. And, only about 5% of preterm babies have CP. So, it's probably reasonable to assume that they didn't have CP. So Voiter was below the line because we're like, there's actually just not really any evidence in CP, so we don't know. We haven't got evidence to say that it works. For CP. And then thinking of ones like DMI and CME. So but those 2, there were no systematic reviews, no other published papers that we could find in CP. And so both of the references for those interventions, we then looked at the clinical trials register, the clinicaltrials.gov register of clinical trials. And so that's what we referred to in both of those. So there's the CME, there's a study that it says on the trial register it's completed, but there hasn't been anything published that I know of that may have changed in the last tiny little bit of time. But at the time that we drew all this, that we searched for all this evidence, hadn't been published. So again, like nothing published to say that we know that it works in CP. And DMI, there's one study that was on that clinical trial register that is currently underway in Egypt. But again, there's nothing that's been published to say that it works in CP.
Really interesting. And I just want to read what was written about CME, just to ask some questions around. So it says CME, the clinical bottom line is that whilst this therapy is widely available in private clinics, despite the lack of evidence, it is scientifically unlikely to work, as the individual's role in the movement is passive, not active. I'd love to linger there for a little bit because that's sort of the scientifically unlikely to work. Talk us through what that means.
So I guess we think about the mechanism of action with a lot of these interventions. So how not only does it work or doesn't it work, but like how do we think it works? which is really important to keep in mind, because so how is this, what's the proposed mechanism of action for that? And is that feasible that would work in CP? And so when we compare that mechanism of action to other interventions that have a similar kind of approach or a similar sort of mechanism, we don't think that it makes sense that would be effective. And we consider, and we would consider it to be a more passive intervention, like everyone sort of says, oh no, the child's working really hard, and and like, yes, they're not passive in the sense that it's not like doing passive movements or passive stretches, like where the child's lying there not doing anything. But it's not active in that, like, who is deciding to make that movement happen? It's not the child kind of initiating that movement and doing a movement that they want to do. It's them kind of responding to a movement that someone's making their body do.
Yes. I love that distinction.
And so thinking about
passive, because passive, like you said, often people think it's just like someone's moving them entirely. But we're talking about passive as in neurologically, who's making the choice, the self-initiation of the movement, which, as we know, is our active ingredients for motor learning, for example. And often the way that they're practiced is so removed from a real life task that you need to do that then if you're not practicing that real life task, then we don't see that task actually gets better. Like, they might get better at that very specific way of being handled or being, the very specific techniques that are used. But then they may be no better at sitting on their own, or, they may be no better at standing and walking.
Look, as a physio, obviously we're always looking into, different ideas and different trains of thought. So to see what validity there is, I guess, evidence behind it. And we know there's no scientific evidence for DMI, but obviously I wanted to look into it just to see, because a lot of the families we know are accessing it in the community. And when I was reading through some information on DMI, I was interested when it said that one of the goals of it is to provoke a specified active motor response from the child in response by defined dynamic exercises prescribed by the therapist. So that's kind of what you're saying in terms of the passive component, is that the movement is initiated or provoked by the therapist and not the child themselves. Is that right?
Yeah. And so then when you take that to a very different context where the child is sitting there and thinks, oh, I might get up and walk and go and get, a drink from the fridge. That's a very different kettle of fish to what is happening inside in a therapy session where someone else is dictating your movement. Because, getting up and walking over to the fridge, that has a whole extra, level of complexity and processes and planning and, things that need to happen.
So I think in that itself is quite interesting, because, that was taken directly from the website, because that's where you can find information about DMI. And it is specified in there that it is in response to a defined dynamic exercises, which significantly contrasts with any scientific information that we do have, which is obviously reflected within this paper. What you do go on to say here, which I found really I love the word opportunity cost, because that's something that we need to be thinking about all the time. I feel like if we're going to be providing an intervention, is it significantly enhancing their outcome so it's worthwhile, or are we taking away an opportunity? And what was said here about DMI was, since other effective approaches exist and there is a lost opportunity cost for the individual. Can you flesh that out a little bit more for us? I've got my understanding of it, but I'd love to hear what you say about that.
It's, this brings me back to like year 11 economics, where you're talking about opportunity cost and, like in an economic kind of sense. But, and like sometimes it is, and like there's lots of, lots of economic kind of things that come into it, but also, there's lots of things that come into it. But economics is certainly one. So one is like the cost of it, that, there's a big cost in delivering some of these interventions. And is that the best way to spend our money? In Australia, we've got the National Disability Insurance Scheme that's always in the media for, spending too much money. And, is that where we want to be spending? Is that the best way to be spending our money? And also opportunity cost in terms of like time for the child as well, and time for the family. Like it really, it really breaks my heart sometimes. I think a lot of parents, and I would say more specifically mothers, are often giving up opportunities to go back to work, and so the impact on the broader family of things like that, so that they can take their child to therapies. And so are you giving that up for a therapy going to be helpful or not. But also, like, is it interfering in other functions? Like, are we improving one function? So some of the things like the garment therapies, again, have fallen below that worth it line.
Too,
and, you know, like, is that worth it? Is the outcome worth it in terms of then the impact on other areas of functioning, like independence with dressing or toileting or things like that? And so, what other areas of function is it giving up? And also, like, if you're spending your time doing a therapy like that, what are you not spending your time doing? And is that things that might just be a lot more fun, you know, like staying at home and playing with your siblings, or going to daycare again. Like, it makes me really sad sometimes when I hear that kids aren't going to daycare, and the primary reason for that is so that they can go to therapy. And I think, daycare is so good for kids, you know, daycare or school, like, it's so good for kids.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And, you know, so, like, what do you give? Yeah, what are the things that they're giving up? And also, what interventions are they not having? And, like, I know I'm a physio, I believe really strongly in, you know, like, trying to, you know, in motor skills and all that sort of stuff. But there's plenty of times that I'm like, do you know what? I don't think this is the thing to spend your dollars and time on. I think, you know, what's actually going to make a bigger difference for a child's function is communication. Like, spend your time doing speech with a speech pathologist, or you know, independent, like, self-care, practice of self-care tasks, or you know, things like that, being able to access assistive technology. I love that. And
there's so much in there, isn't it?
So much. Even things like you know, therapies to promote function, and, you know, get it on-time mobility framework, and getting kids up in walkers. You know, I don't want kids to miss out on that, because I know I love seeing when I go out and see kids just interacting in their walkers upright, you know, from 1 year of age.
Absolutely.
You don't want kids not having those opportunities, because we're trying to work towards the developmental milestones and obtaining the postural control for those before we do other things. So it's not only, like you said, what they that it has no effect, but it's what they might miss out on in the time while they're doing these things.
Yeah. And I think you know, I've seen many adults with CP speak about this at conferences or just in discussions, and, you know, and they're sort of like, oh God, can we move on from walking being the be all and end all? Like, I actually didn't care that I couldn't walk and had to use my wheelchair most of the time. I don't know, you know, and I think it's a really hard tightrope to walk between we want to help someone improve their function as much as possible, but also someone needs to live their life, and, you know,
everything needs to be evaluated.
Are we doing that at the cost of
that's right,
of other things?
Everything needs to be evaluated, and we need to be thinking about that opportunity cost all the time of what's relevant for that person. And we have this to guide us. And I guess the other part to why things are below the worth it line is not only is it scientifically not likely to work for things that we do know that work by comparison. It's also adverse events, isn't it? So you did list some adverse events for ones below the worth it line. And that was in particular with suit therapy, wasn't it? Suit therapy,
Yeah. So there's been some issues with, like, overheating, like, you know, maintaining, like body temperature regulation, being quite sick. I'm trying to think what some of the other ones are now.
Even whilst
also other interventions. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Even whilst you're thinking about that, like, overheating is a big deal because for kids who have seizures, being too warm, all that can really set them off too. We know that, right? So we do need to be very thoughtful about temperature control. That's vital.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And it can impact on, like, sometimes the compression over the tummy can affect things like VP shunt function and like gastrointestinal function and things like that.
You really do need to think about that, don't you? And I guess the other flip side of that as well is if there's not much research done in an intervention, you don't know what the adverse events are. There are some anecdotal reports, because obviously there's anecdotal reports about DMI and CME, but there's also anecdotal reports about the adverse events, which is not reported in here, but we have heard about them in terms of femoral fractures, you know. That does
respiratory arrest, and, you know, things like that.
Yes. So I guess, again, the value of making sure we're evidence-based.
Absolutely.
Following and studying it. Okay, so that's what we know doesn't work and things that are below the worth it line currently for its evidence. Let's talk about things that are above the worth it line. Should we talk about the ones that you feel are the go-tos for the clinicians that are out there? What's there? What should we be doing? What's above this line, Monica?
What's above the line? Yes.
Yeah.
So some of the things that are above the line were, so hippotherapy is one. So that's not heaps done in Australia, actually. Like there's things like riding for the disabled, which is probably not strictly hippotherapy. Like that's more kind of adaptive horse riding, and, as an activity. It's not really strictly hippotherapy. Yeah, so that's not a big one in Australia. But yeah, that one's above the line. Botox for the upper and lower limb is above the line. Again, I just want to point out this is for outcomes related to spasticity and gait outcomes.
Yes, of course.
So, I know Botox is
not across everything. That's right.
Yes, no, and I know there's been a lot in, in the last few years about what are some of the, what are some of the adverse effects of Botox. But for those outcomes, there's good evidence for them. And SDR and ITD as well. So reducing spasticity and helping with movement and pain and dystonia. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting in terms of what is listed above that line. And I mean, hippotherapy is something that I remember being always really shocked. I'm like, hippotherapy's there. But when you're thinking about actual postural control and what it does, and children probably really enjoy it as well. That's the other part of it.
Yeah, that's right. And so the compliance with hippotherapy is often really good because it's really fun. You're just going to ride a horse. Yeah. The other thing about hippotherapy compared to things like whole body vibration, for example. So like a horse is a lot more unpredictable. And so you are actually learning to, and the way a horse moves, it's done in a really controlled environment. You're not going to have bolting horses.
It's not a wild rodeo.
No. But, like the way a horse moves and, stops and starts and things like that, like the way you need to learn to adjust as that's happening is quite different to something that's a much more kind of constant and less variable
that's such a good point.
Situation.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So they're the ones we know about, but there's
obviously this other section.
There's two more.
There's two more.
Hip surveillance. Hip surveillance and scoliosis surgery as well. So I mean, scoliosis surgery, it makes sense that if someone's got a really significant scoliosis, and then you put metal rods in their spine to straighten it up.
Function.
Yeah, that's quite effective. That's good. Yes, yeah. And it's really interesting. Like we find a lot of kids after scoliosis surgery, their function is a lot better because all of a sudden they've got metal rods holding them in place rather than their muscles trying to hold them in place. And that can that can be
how reassuring
reduces
for
the degrees of freedom.
To know that though, because I think it's such a big surgery and you sort of and ah about it a fair bit and go, should we do it? But it's great to know that it
can. And often
people
people going to it too late.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good one for us to know about. Yeah.
And now we move it to that big yellow section. So it's above the worth it line. So it's probably do it. They have some evidence and we probably can do it. And there's quite a lot in there. So I'll get you to talk through what are the big things from that area.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, there's a lot of things that people would be some of the go-to. So things like AFOs, standing frames, hand splints, balance training. So that makes sense that if you do some balance training, then your postural control would improve. And cerebroplasty and Botox, standing frames, different types of surgery for lower limbs and sleep positioning systems for people, but probably over 2 years old. We don't recommend the use of them in children under 2. And then some different tone management drugs. So they're sort of some of the things that are in that yellow probably do it area.
And I guess when it's probably do it, it's just a matter of making sure we take, like with everything, outcome measures, evaluating the effect for that individual child.
Yes.
Like that's the main thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think really keeping in mind that end goal, like there might be an issue with postural deformity or postural control, but what are we actually wanting to improve?
Yes.
Like, what is that limiting?
Yes.
What are we actually wanting to improve at the end of the day?
Yeah.
Because yes, that might be one of the things that's limiting that, but is that the only thing that we can change, or is addressing that actually going to improve that outcome?
I like that.
Yeah. And I often think of it like the old lady who swallowed the fly, like the further away from the swallowing the fly, if you have to swallow a cat to swallow to swallow the bird, to swallow the spider, to swallow the fly, like the more steps there are, is that
a great
really
analogy. I love
working?
it.
You know, like, and
Yes.
part of why that story is so funny is because it just gets more and more absurd,
Yeah.
you know, like, but sometimes this is what we're sort of expecting sometimes, you know, we're
That's
like 4
true.
steps removed from what we're actually wanting to improve.
Yeah.
And is that actually making a difference?
Yeah. I think about, in my head, I think about Ginny Pallig, and she often goes, you know, is this magical thinking? And, you know, let's just actually think really, really analytically about what it is that we want to try to achieve. And there's a lot of things here above the worth it line to look at and look at what the goals might be and the health and well-being of the child and their family, like on a and it comes back to what Martin Gough was saying back then as well, wasn't it? Look at the personal and environmental factors. Let's look broadly at what matters.
Yeah, and yes, they might be a bit straighter, but is this had an impact on the family because it's now a lot more burden for the caregiver, or they're now or they're now actually in a bit of pain because we're kind of really forcing them to a position that's not super comfortable for them.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
That's such a good point. And it's like an extra 2 degrees of extra active postural control worth the 50 hours that it took to go to sessions and the opportunity cost. Like it's really evaluating all those things, isn't it? Yeah. And, you know, I hear, you know, like, and yes, their trunk control might be better, but can they sit? Like, you know, can they, like, and there's really varying, you know, like for some children, it might make the difference between like someone who's doing FCS4, you know, like, so now they can sit independently on the edge of the bed so their parent can get them dressed. That's a really meaningful change. But if they can sit still on a really still flat surface for a couple of seconds, does that mean that anything in their life they can function any better, you know, in anything really? Yeah. That leads me, okay, well, that's a really good point.
We have a question to kind of bring everything together because there's so much from this. So if a child has hypertonia, so they have low postural tone and control, how possible is it as therapists for us to increase their postural control?
So say,
GMFCS
4 or 5, you know, like if you, you know, and they've got low postural control, they've got low tone. What we should be doing there? Like if we're clinicians sort of looking at this child in front of them, like should they be trying to improve their postural control? Should they be providing support? How possible is it to improve their postural control given that neurological impact and all the connections? I don't know, what would your thoughts be on that based on what you've found here?
Yeah, so some of my thoughts, like bringing it back to kind of neuroscience or the neuroplasticity sort of theories, you know, like how long is it since the injury? So if you've got someone who's 5, 10, 15 years old, they've got a brain that's been working like this for 15, you know, for that length of time. And how much can we change how that works? But also on the other hand, you know, we've got that move it or lose it kind of, you know, use it or lose it principle as well. So if you're not practicing, you're not going to get better at something that you don't practice. So that's kind of conflicting on that part of, you know, on that side of things. But also thinking about, you know, like some of the children who have who are GMFCS level 4 and 5, like a lot more of the brain is affected. Like how much are we, like the brain structures and processes that have to happen in the brain, how much are we going to be able to change that? I don't know. Like, is it possible? I don't want to 100% say like, no, we can't improve anything, but I would try and have really realistic, really conservative kind of, well, let's try it for a little while and see if we improve this, or, you know, or do we need to try and improve this? Can we accommodate with something else? You know, like I think thinking about the alternatives that exist to trying to improve postural control. I think, I mean, most of the evidence hasn't shown that there's going to be a huge effect on postural control. Having said that, I mean, there's always limitations, you know, there's limitations to the studies. It's really hard to measure some of these things. But I would really try and think about what's going on in the background. How do I think this is going to work? And how is that going to work on a background of a brain that has, you know, had a fairly significant injury? And what else might be effective? Like this is not your only option.
Yeah, that's right. I guess it's putting all your eggs in one basket kind of thing. It's I guess we want function as well. And I remember talking to Carol Schrader not that long ago, and she was saying, you know, I don't want my child to arrive at school every day tired because they're working so hard to get there and they can't learn. So you do want to make sure that you are providing opportunities to do what they need to be able to do, and providing support, providing postural support will allow them to do that. So they don't have to think about what they're doing for sitting. They can actually sit with support and then they can concentrate and learn as well.
Because, thinking about what's automatic and what's not automatic about postural control, like when any of us do something that's more posturally challenging, that uses up more of our brain power. And so if you're using all your brain power on trying to stay upright and, like you haven't got much free for other things. And especially when other things may already be more challenging, like with communication, if like the mechanics coordinating your muscles to move for speaking is already tricky, and then you're trying to,
laid onto that a pretty significant brain injury with all the effects that will happen in the capacity. And also postural control, like static postural control in sitting is one thing, but then sitting, we don't sit to do, very rarely do we sit to just sit, like we sit and do things. And so like it might be fine sitting, but can you sit and reach, or sit and, bring food to your mouth to eat, or sit and do things. And so I think that's what I think is missing sometimes when you're just practicing those really static postural control things. That's right.
Does it make a difference to someone's function?
Always think in the bigger picture. Look, we have so many more questions for you, but we have significantly run out of time. So we clearly do need to keep talking about more things within this review. I really encourage everyone to have a look at this article. We'll put a link for it in our website so you can actually have a look at everything that's been included in there, because we certainly haven't been able to complete all of it, but we've had at least some discussions around it. So we do need to now...
Could I add a plug too? I would encourage people to go back to the papers that we reference as well, because I think obviously in a review like this, we can only include a really small amount of information that has come from a paper that already has a lot of information. So I'd really encourage people to, if you've got interventions that you're particularly interested in, to go back to those too.
Such a good idea, because it's like, 2,000 participants, or how many was that?
Was it 22,000?
Yeah, 22,000. So you can't just put that all in one word-limited systematic review. Look, before we finish up though, we should wrap it all up, bring it all together in our favourite segment, which is what everyone says, Tell It to Ed. Ed, as you know, is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening on this episode, I'm sure, taking notes, pressing buttons and faders and things like that. So before Ed launches into his question, Monica, I'll get you to summarise what we've spoken about today, which is a fair bit of stuff, in about 60 seconds or so, and Ed can ask you a question. So take it away, Monica.
Okay, well, so Ed, with as part of a really large team, we reviewed evidence from systematic reviews of interventions aimed to improve the ability of people with CP to maintain their postural control or balance, or for people who had higher levels of movement limitation, looking at interventions that affected their posture and prevention of musculoskeletal deformities over time. And the evidence on the whole was of low quality, so it's hard to draw really strong conclusions or make strong recommendations. But there are some interventions that we think aren't worth it, and that's interventions that are more passive, and where the person isn't as involved in working on them in moving themselves. And based on the evidence, there were others that might be effective, and that's a lot of the interventions that we use. And so we would really encourage people to measure those interventions and the outcomes and think about all the things that are happening and the other effects that are happening. And then there's another group of interventions that in most cases we think are really effective. And we encourage clinicians to keep in mind the unintended effects of intervention and watch out for these as well.
That was a beautiful summary.
Well,
that was great. That was great.
Very good for a 60-second wrap-up.
Exactly. Well done, Monica. All right. Now it's Ed's turn. Take it away, Ed.
Look, I've really loved today's conversation, and I think one of the things that kind of grabbed me was the conversation piece about opportunity cost and I guess real life functionality, quality of life differences, and you've obviously talked about interventions that are worth it or deemed to be worth it, and those that possibly aren't. And I guess my question is probably going to be a little bit devil's advocate, I guess, maybe. And I know that sitting through nearly 200 episodes, and we're getting really close to that mark now, and I've kind of heard a lot of things.
I was hoping I'd get a prize being 200.
So I've heard a lot about the whole research world, and a lot of it's very fascinating. And I guess there's that whole 17-year gap between the implementation of research and into clinical practice, and that concept that, you know, the absence of evidence might not be the evidence of an absence of effectiveness. And I guess there's these interventions that are below the worth it line. They seem to run on anecdotal evidence because obviously there's lots of before, lots of after videos, and people seem very convinced by it. And I guess my question is how do we account for those results scientifically? And is maturation or kids just growing up part of what we're seeing there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's always really tricky to tease out what's as a result of intervention, also how long those effects are. Like, so for some of the interventions, like we said, stretching, it's, you know, probably not really something that's effective. But when you look at some of the studies, they're like the really short-term effect of stretching. Like when you stretch a muscle and then, you know, 10, 30 seconds later, you measure how much a joint can move, it's better. But then when you go back 10 minutes later, 30 minutes later, you know, 2 days later, it's not effective. And so I wonder if that's what's coming into some of these, that, you know, like there's that immediate effect of like, oh, I've just been practicing this and, you know, yes, I am a little bit better at this.
Wow.
I wonder if that's if there's a little bit of that's happening as well. But I also wonder with some of those interventions, like in a very specific context and, you know, when you're practicing a very specific movement or activity, yes, that they might get better at that. But then, I don't know, I always come back to this, well, then so what? Like, how is their life, what's going to be easier to do in their life, or what can they do better now because they can do that?
Such an interesting, thought-provoking answer. I love that. That is so good. The stretching one's an interesting one because I often try to stretch and then I feel really good. And then you look at my range, you know, half an hour later, I'm like, oh, it's gone. The next day, I'm like, oh, it's gone. That's right. That's what the evidence says. It's true. Yeah. Really interesting perspective.
I guess one really quick follow-up to that, though, is obviously I've talked about the research being, well, kind of behind clinical practice. Well, clinical practice being behind research and the evidence that kind of gets generated. Like, are some people just simply ahead of the game? Like, is there something where the scientific community is kind of pointing in a direction and these guys are obviously pointing in a different direction, and are they 17 years ahead is basically what I'm asking.
That's a really good question. Look, it's hard to answer. I would say some of these interventions are based on interventions that are older and have, you know, we kind of do know that they're not effective, or, you know, in all the time that intervention has existed, there hasn't been any research done in CP. And so is it reasonable to assume that this new version of that old intervention is going to work? And also I think alongside of that, like, you know, like, yes, you know, there's some of these sort of newer interventions, but thinking always about what's the mechanism of action and what do we know, like, what are always coming back to those ingredients of like, what do we know does improve function, and does that intervention fit in with those principles? And so I always come back to, you know, I always say to parents, you need to really think about whose brain is working. You know, I mean, this is a classic Karin and Novak thing, you know, whose brain is working. Like, is your child's brain telling their body to move, or is someone else telling your child's body how to move?
Amazing. Yeah, great. Lots of things to think about. Good questions, Ed.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
No, I think that there's lots to think about from there. Monica, it was so wonderful to speak with you. Like, we've spoken for nearly an hour, and I feel like I could talk to you for so much longer still. Like, just absolutely brilliant. Thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, we've loved it.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to see what you move on to in the future. But we could keep talking about this. But I know
we'll talk about that offline.
Yeah,
let's talk about that. That's for sure. For all of our listeners, you know, really encourage you to have a look at this article. Like I said, head to our website, researchworks.net. We'll put a link for that there so you can find it. And of course, there's a CPD form there that you can fill out as well to keep this as part of your record of your PD requirements. So stay tuned, and we'll have so much more to come as we head towards our 200th episode. My goodness.
It's amazing.
Isn't it amazing? Amazing. And Monica, thank you again.
Great.
Oh, thank you. And thank you again, Monica, and to all of our listeners. We'll talk to you all again really soon. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.